ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, students, friends who are all here, good evening to you. Before I start, I just want to say how incredibly honored I feel to be delivering this first Roelof Uytenbogaardt Memorial Lecture. I've always seen myself as something of an amateur as an urban designer, and I've always felt very separate from the people who are really at the coalface in urban design. But perhaps this amateur status has given me also a little bit of more time to dream a bit. Now, the city, we are told regularly by those who study and write about it, is in a crisis. Globally, we are now 50% urbanized, and in many places, the pace at which we are continuing to do so is increasing. There are lots of reasons for this rush, but a major one is the disparity between rich and poor, together with the fact that the tantalizing fruits of global capitalist consumerism are visible to anyone, anywhere. So we now have accelerating numbers and sizes of what is called the megacity, with a population of over 8 million people. I recently experienced 3 megacities, Tokyo, 36 million people in a continuous urban area, Osaka, 18 million people in a continuous urban area, and Hong Kong, which is between 7 and 8. And I could see what critics and commentators are saying about them. Spatially, they're badly out of control. They're a hodgepodge. And I think if you look at the slide, you can see that it's a hodgepodge. No rational set of rules could have produced the urban scene that you're looking at. All the categories through which we've come to understand cities traditionally are no longer relevant in places like this. The concept of home is almost meaningless. The idea of the street as a social place related to a home is considerably diminished. It's very difficult to know in Tokyo where the center of the city is, which the center is. If you take one district or another, it's almost impossible to think which one's which, to determine the difference from the one to the other. And if you look at the cities themselves, they're no longer identifiable places. They're all the same brand. There's no longer any place there. So we stranded in what the American critic and urban designer said in the 1960s. We stranded in a non-place urban realm. It's interesting to look back on urban history for a moment and see that in the almost exactly 100 years ago, people like Saint-Hilaire were doing these drawings which predicted or which showed the idea of this wonderful, new, exciting city that was on the horizon, and see how close it is now close it is to what is happening now. Now, if you think about it, in the middle of all of that, 50 years after this, in the 1960s, there was an extremely powerful and very appropriate, widespread criticism of exactly this kind of modernist city. And yet here we have it today, all built just exactly as they predicted. If you think about it, in the 1960s, a favorite pastime in a lot of Europe was to watch implosions of pieces of modernist city. Do we want it? Do we want this kind of city? It seems mostly globally that we do, because cities all around the world, if you look on the website, market their graduation to world-class status with almost identical images. And even cities which have long established identity and quality have completely lost the plot, or I think so. I don't see why we have to try and fashion ourselves as a variation of this fashionable brand of so-called world-class city. High-tech, factory-made, glossy, seductive, narcissistic, inscrutable, corporate, oriented to the rich, tediously the same, and destructive of place. I think we should be aiming for and persuading those in the government who don't agree, and the corporate community and civil society, that we have a different idea of world class. Low-tech, labor-intensive, many-textured, articulate, connective, human scale, oriented to everyone, wonderfully different, and highly sensitive to the particularities of place. It's in the poorer countries of the world where megacities are really multiplying. Places like Sao Paulo and Lagos, where there is much less economic power, much less efficient technology and social discipline. And they keep going, it seems to me, mainly through the outstanding capacity of human beings for adaptation, for suffering, and for working out strategies of survival, even against almost impossible odds. But the economic disparities that there are here, the overcrowding, the difficulty and frustration of existence, evokes a social friction which is widespread and dangerous. And if their social sustainability is precarious, they guzzle land, destroy ecosystems, emit pollution at unacceptable rates. In South Africa, the crisis in the cities potentially is greater still. Although they're a good bit smaller than the ones that we've been looking at, Cape Town by 2030 will have 5 million inhabitants. That's 1.5 million more than we are now, nearly 40% bigger in population. And Johannesburg is already 13 million people. There are many signs of the developing megacity here, which, knowing that South Africa's got a poorer economy than Nigeria and is growing slower, is going to be of the Lagos variety. Added to that, we have the legacy of our history. Apartheid, which split races and classes. And I think the diagram on your left, to me, epitomizes it. This was Verwoerd's idea of a town with its 7 different ethnic areas, each divided in the ratio in which the population was divided in the different ethnic groups, all separated from each other. So apartheid split races and classes, and modernist planning divided everything into parcels, favored the motor car as a means of transport, and helped to generate a spreading suburbanism. Every institution, every human institution is suburbanized, from a school to a house to a hospital, whatever it is. This fractured form continues to sustain the inequity of the past, together with all the problems associated with racial separation. We have extremely inequitable cities, which metaphorically are bleeding with the wounds. As Adam Habib said in Grahamstown last year, and many people have reiterated it, our fundamental weakness is inequality. And no city form could aggravate inequality more than the one that we live in daily. So we're faced with a question: what needs to happen in the spatial design of our cities and in their making that will contribute to a future that is reasonably free of conflict, in which our citizens have a chance to lead a reasonably good life? What is a city of the good life that we really want? The forces that are making these cities are not inevitable natural ones. We can make decisions and take actions that will make them closer to what we want. The city of the good life surely is one which, as a bottom line, helps to satisfy fundamental human needs of all its citizens. Now, the question of what fundamental human needs are could be the subject of a lecture in itself. But the articulation that I prefer is one by Manfred Max Neef, a Chilean economist. He had had a lot of experience in the 1980s in development and was asked by the United Nations to research why development aid was proving to be such a failure. He concluded that the real problem was that the main approaches were far too focused on the economic measures, the level of the GDP, and thus only fulfilled singular needs that often interfered with the fulfillment of others. So the aid made matters worse rather than better. So he looked for alternatives that would take the whole human being into account and were aimed at self-reliance, personal self-reliance. And he came up with these 9 human needs that you can see on this wheel. There's a lot that could be said about them, but they're really 2 critical ideas that he had which are relevant to this discussion. The first one is the idea that poverty and wealth don't only refer to the issue of survival, which is his subsistence category. You may be poor economically, but very rich in affection, being a very good person, a community person, say, for instance. And what Max Neef was doing was looking to harness those positive richnesses in order to solve the poverties that there were in individual and collective lives. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that he articulated a number of categories of satisfiers of needs. And there were a whole lot of them, but there are two more important ones here. The inhibiting satisfier is one which appears to be satisfying a need, but there are inhibiting factors that actually block or restrict the scope of that satisfaction. So it could be argued, for instance, that a top-down housing process in this country is an inhibiting satisfier. You might get a house, i.e. satisfying the need for shelter, that's the subsistence category, but your long wait and expectation will have inhibited your initiative, that is creation, further blocking other needs like identity and participation and so on. So that's a negative satisfier of need, of basic need. What he was looking for was what he called synergic satisfiers, which were ones that met a whole lot of needs at the same time and got a synergy going amongst all these needs of satisfaction. So a bottom-up housing process is a very good example of this. Not only do you get a house that's of subsistence, you decide what it's like, participation, you acquire building skills in the process, understanding, which builds up your self-esteem, identity and affection, and it requires your initiative, creative. So you can see that sort of synergy that's created with a process like that. Now, the kind of city that I would be looking for is one that through spatial, the design, and in the process of its making, helps to provide this kind of synergic action for all its inhabitants. And I do want to emphasize here that the city alone obviously cannot do all of this. But because there's this close connection between spatial organization and social relationships, it obviously can contribute to it. Now, at the risk of oversimplification on one hand and immodesty on the other, I want to work my way through a number of projects with which I've been involved and suggest in them that, without any particular forethought of mine at all, lie some of the seeds of the human-scale city of the good life. I was educated as a modernist, and most architects of the modern movement saw architecture as being part of a new kind of a city. The avant-garde in the 1960s was represented by Team 10, who were my role models. They were closely aware of the alienation of the modernist city. Team 10 at that period were very aware of the problem that there was in the lack of identity that there was in them, and of the alienation that had been caused by them, and also of the tremendously vigorous criticism of them that there was by social scientists at the time. One of the main missing ingredients, as I've suggested, in what they saw as a far too mechanical and diagrammatic city that was evolving, was this thing of identity. And here's another part of Roehampton that shows, I think, quite clearly on the left-hand side that loss of identity, and on the right-hand side, people in the same kind of project trying to give it some kind of identity. And that Team 10 felt was a quality that was essential to a person's sense of well-being, of who I am and to whom I belong. So in their sketches for a new city, reflecting the mobile, fast-changing world, they sought to achieve this kind of identity. Now, as a student, I'd spent a fair amount of time in Soweto and other places like Daveyton, which these photographs are of from that period. And I was depressed by two things: the unremittingly monotonous landscape of little houses provided by the government, and the complete lack of the normal commercial, entertainment, community facilities of an urban existence, except for beer halls run by the government, which funded the housing. And I think the picture on the right-hand side of Daveyton Town Centre, I think, says it all. So my final project as an architectural student, and for some reason these drawings didn't make it to the exhibition, was a neighborhood centre in Naledi in Soweto, which was visualized as something larger, or what the Smithsons would have called something larger that would be a web, that would stretch across the whole area and give it some kind of identifiable structure. The project tried to use some of the Smithson's devices and geometries and so on, but where it was very different from theirs was that it was made with a series of different kinds of urban uses and functions that were put together to shape a sequence of pedestrianized public squares. So it was closer to other models that there were around at that time, like the Lanebaan in Rotterdam and Vällingby near Stockholm. Spending an academic year in Venice soon afterwards gave me the opportunity of experiencing and living in such pedestrianized public spaces. The academic year was disrupted because there were student disturbances, which were the precursor of those that culminated in Paris in 1968. So I was left a lot to my own devices, and I spent a good amount of time measuring and drawing the squares of Venice and observing them in action. And I experienced for the first time the joys of a city designed as a home for its citizens, where the great and small public spaces acted as living rooms. I experienced the extraordinary symbiosis of space and human use that gave freedom for any kind of activity, children's play to wedding processions, meeting of friends to citywide celebrations, informal markets to political rallies. And if you wanted to step out of the action, there were always more secluded exterior spaces or accessible church interiors, which were part of the public realm. All it seemed was accommodated effortlessly and perfectly in a completely pedestrian environment. It was also clear how the spaces were the locus of local identity and gathering, as well as for rubbing shoulders with strangers. And most significantly, these wonderful public rooms were equally accessible to rich and poor. Speculating on reading about how cities like Venice were designed, it was clear that although the major decisions were made about where the port would be, the main civic center, the military establishment in the city, and although the structure of the city was representative of the politics of the time, that was an oligarchy or the rule of the nobles, its most intimate form was the result of a myriad of small-scale decisions that were monitored by representatives of the city as a whole. The people built the city, piece by piece. So when we entered the Manila competition, an international housing competition in 1975, we tried to set up a framework of major city spaces related to public buildings, and they were all held in a grid of houses that was intended to give considerable scope for alteration and addition. By this time, we'd read Turner's Freedom to Build and recognized the simple but profound truth that there is in that housing or city are nouns, not verbs. They are processes, and building them offers huge opportunities for employment, learning of skills, and the general use of creativity and initiative. Indeed, synergic, just exactly as Max Neef said, and capable of generating long-term self-reliance. Looking at the project now, we were obviously too caught up, I think, in the rather scientific, systemic thinking of the time, but it's also good to see in the solar panels and in the urban agriculture and the water storage that we also had some sense of the ecological discourse that was just starting around that period. 10 years later, during a state of emergency, in the sort of darkest days of apartheid, I was fortunate to become involved with the Western Cape Hostel Dwellers Association project and was able to explore some of these ideas further. And those ideas were reinforced also by reading of certain theorists like Christopher Alexander, Harbrocken, Crane, and Hillier, those sort of people. But even more so, I was stimulated by the thinking of my colleagues at UCT, who for many years had been researching and publishing in and around the idea of a high-density city and all its implications. And not least, in the background, there was the model of Roelof Uytenbogaardt's built portion of Belhar, which to me is still a model of how we can approach urbanism in this part of the country. And in the foreground of the work was my close colleague of the time, Paul Andrew, with his experience and insight, an unsurpassed capacity to envision the city and draw his visions with astounding speed. And this was the kind of thing that he would drop, as he would say, drop out in about an hour and a half in an afternoon when you were working on an idea for a starter unit. But the central reality of this project had nothing to do with me or my colleagues. The first and most crucial fact was that it was generated by the community. This is not to suggest that outsiders did not play a role, they did. But when Paul and I were briefed in 1985 in Nyanga East, it was by the leadership of the Hostels Association. In Max Neef's terms, they were very poor in terms of subsistence and understanding because mostly they had a very limited formal education, but they were very rich in identity, affection, and participation. The problem they presented to us was that rooms that had been designed in the hostel areas for 2 to 3 people were now occupied by 2 to 3 families. That's on average 4 people per bed. And they wanted initially, with the past laws still applying, to have accommodation that would be sufficient for 1 person per room without anybody having to move. This changed later as the past laws were abolished in 1987 to a need for family accommodation. So that was Langa in 1985. Those were the hostel blocks in 1985, and those were in fact occupied with that incredible overcrowding. But this request for an improvement to the living condition was only part of a much bigger project of human development and empowerment that they had, which should fulfill a wide range of human needs. In fact, for the first 8 or 9 years, we were merely the spatial arm of a much broader enterprise, which essentially was a political mover to draw hostel dwellers into the freedom struggle. The enterprise included leadership training, improvement of health, provision of early learning, advice offices, the creation of jobs and skills development, and the setting up of fresh produce markets. Not all of this flowered anything like to the extent that was hoped, for various reasons. However, the success of the project, which I think can be gauged from the fact that it's still continuing and has housed 5,000 families, in fact, there's a piece of it going right up now as you came in Bunga Avenue, it must be largely attributed to the evidence that the hostel's community briefed it. They were kept continuously informed about it, and we made sure that they could always read our drawings very easily and understand them easily. They made all the crucial decisions, and this participation has now been going on for 30 years. Just consider the productivity of the synergies developed from an approach aiming to solve many needs at once. And it wasn't simply the leadership that was involved. They worked through this very rapid word-of-mouth communication that had been developed in the struggle years. So when there was a meeting to give the go-ahead for the demonstration units, 500 people attended it, more than twice the number of people who are in this hall. There's a nice anecdote to reinforce the extent of participation. We started these demonstration units in a situation in Langa where one of the hostels, that double-story hostel, had had a fire, and they had to fix it up. So it was an opportunity to build units that would show how the system would work. So we'd fix up the old buildings, and in between, in the space that you can see in front of the top left-hand photograph, we would build new units. And the process would be that the people from the hostels would go into the new units, the old one would be fixed up, and then they'd split, half in the new and half in the old. That was this rollover process, we called it, and it could be demonstrated here. And that's what happened. Now, when it came to planting trees there was a lot of skepticism that went around. In fact, people said, these things are going to be vandalized or they'll be used for firewood. Well, we went about a year later, and there were the trees growing beautifully. And we commented on it. And we were told that, well, there was a watering committee that made sure that the trees were tended every day. So I think that gives some idea of the ownership of the project and the extent of participation that there was in it. I must also add, if I'm talking about the success of the project, is that it's also connected to the stamina and insistence on proper building practice of my ex-partner Dita Bosso. I would also like to say that the consultants also participated. We were caught up in this synergy. We didn't sit in ivory towers, but we were in the project boots and all. We identified with it, we believed in it, and we fought for it. And ourselves were empowered, learned enormously from it, and made many friends through it. The second most crucial aspect of the project was in the area of planning method. There were not many empty sites. And the sites themselves were really built-up environments, and as you can see, by the late 1980s, a lot of it was completely filled with informal dwellings, and the people who lived there had also to be accommodated in the project. But fortunately, there was enough room between the buildings to allow this process that I've described with the demonstration units that we went through. And incidentally, in that process also, it was cheaper to fix up the old ones, and what we saved on fixing up the old ones was used to cross-subsidize into the building of the new ones. But it didn't mean that from a design point of view, decisions were extremely constrained. We had to squeeze buildings in. There's a piece of Nyanga that I think shows it reasonably well. We had to squeeze new buildings into the urban fabric and somehow cobble together the streets and squares that we were aiming for. Although later there were these local spatial development frameworks that were provided by the city, which we were required to connect into, the ideas that were in them were very broad, and our process of design was really largely ad hoc, incremental, and without any chance or very little chance of repetition and mass production. The great boon of this process was variety. A much greater variety in the urban landscape we felt was achieved than would be possible with an empty site. So the three areas developed distinctive identity. So this is Nyanga, and in Nyanga, the particular dimensions of Nyanga evoked a varied typology of building and urban space. So you can see on the diagram on the bottom left that it was really merely squeezing it all in that you got a kind of variation that came out of it. And the squeezing in of buildings, which you can see in the plan on the top left, the squeezing in of those buildings forced us to develop this varied typology. That gives you an idea of the different kinds of buildings that were evoked by that site and different kinds of urban space. In Gugulethu, the spaces between the existing buildings, and you can see it in the photograph, gave opportunities to make courtyards. And then there were very wide road reserves, but they were of slightly different dimensions, which also evoked a great differences from one street to another. So you got court-like spaces in between the blocks, with buildings going in between the blocks, and all the existing ones are on the outside, and that produced these sort of court spaces, and then the different streets dimensions evoke different kinds of streets. So you could identify with this kind of street or that kind of street. There was enough difference in the place to give identity for individual streets. In Langa, there was this extraordinary sort of lozenge-shaped organization, which forced us to build around the edge of it mainly in the road reserves. So you got rather odd-shaped triangular courts inside superblocks, which were lined by these long buildings that made them, and it also evoked these big urban squares and long avenues that thread through the project. So these are the sort of big urban squares that came out of that. The Jungle Walk area and New Flats area of Langa was very regimented and all double story, so there was very little room to do anything except close up the ends of the series of blocks, which made quite powerful streets with three-story buildings to them and a street that runs through them. I think the kind of variety that came there echoed the sorts of qualities that we were finding in Venice, where a whole series of decisions made over a long period of time gave a certain difference and identity to places. An important corollary of this was that we had to break rules. So we built into legally defined road reserves and offended all kinds of housing setback regulations. That we were allowed to do so, and without a huge waste of time, was a function, I think, of the period that we were working in. But the buildings were built and the people moved in, which makes you wonder whether there are not far more effective procedures and ways to use expertise than current regulations and procedures allow. Third lesson in the urban planning of the hostels project was the huge impact of what seemed to be small design ideas. And an example of this is the front and backs of buildings. If you look at the hostels before we moved in, there was no front or back. In Nyanga, you could enter the block from either side. In Gugulethu and Langa, the fronts were all in the back. none of the buildings faced onto the street. So one of the first ideas that we had, or principles that we used, was terribly simple, was to relate the building to the street that it was in. And it was amazing the effect that that had. So there was an immediate connection with an identification with the street. And those things of watering trees and so on came out of that. So that the buildings had fronts to the street, and backyards where all the sort of things that go on in backyards can go on, including setting up, I see Cool Place there, which is not exactly what we intended, but that's the sort of thing that happened. Another aspect, what's apparently a small idea, is the paving of the ground. And if you're making a city that is a whole series of rooms to live in, then the floor is incredibly important, because the ground is in fact the floor, the carpet, and in many senses the sort of built-in furniture of the city rooms. And you can see in Paul Andrews' drawing on the left what was intended. And I think it's one of the failures of the hostels project was the inability to recognize the importance of that ground surface, or the inability to pay for it. But it has meant that a lot of the spaces haven't developed that room-like quality that they were intended to. The idea of rooms, a whole series of linked public rooms, was absolutely central to our thinking. And the public places program that came, that you can see in the diagram on the left, was very much part of it. We could see that there was incredible competition between different groups of people for housing in the period that we were working in. And we could see that it would take ages for everybody to be housed. So we developed this idea of this public places program where the city would build a kind of an infrastructure of public spaces with community facilities that were related to it, that would thread right through the community in all sorts of ways, so that everybody could share something of the good life while they were waiting for their house or while they were building their own. And as a device, it also lent itself to connecting parts of the city that hadn't been connected previously before. So this diagram, in fact, shows Langa being connected through to Athlone, to Gunner's Circle, which is obviously a place of work, to Bontelhevel, and across the railway line through into Pinelands, setting up a whole fabric of new urban spaces where the people of the city could meet. That same idea was implicit in a lot of our planning, in the top left-hand corner in Nyanga, where you can see that around the edge of the block, the ones that are slightly darker grey colour, would be public buildings or high-density 3-4-story buildings, and inside those blocks would be starter houses where people would be building their own places. And in the project that was done to demonstrate an idea about how to deal with fires in the townships and the informal settlements, the same idea was implicit, that you could build up this fabric of interconnecting public spaces, and around that and outside it, people go through that slow process of building their own places. Underlying all the projects so far has been the idea of a much higher density city, in which functions of different kinds as far as possible are mixed rather than separate. And I don't think I need to argue that here. It's argued with great clarity in Cape Town's densification policy. Suffice it to say that these two factors are basic foundation stones in a city's capacity to provide its inhabitants with freedom of movement, of choice, and of small-scale business opportunity. Part of Cape Town's plan to achieve the mixture was based on the experience in Curitiba, that's in Brazil, Curitiba's idea of high-density corridors, and both the Mau project and 8448 projects had both been conceived by the Urban Design Department of the City Council as being part of a high-density corridor, what was then known as, or was then Lansdowne Road. It's now Governor Mbeki Road. A Mau, for instance, would be like a seam sewn into the city's fabric. These corridors would make thousands of new homes available, and they'd bring new nodes of all sorts of different kinds of activity, from shopping to offices to light industrial places, community buildings, into areas where there are currently no facilities or work opportunities. They would be related to high-speed bus stops and would create plenty of opportunity for informal trade, and they would link together through the whole city into a kind of a web that would enable parts of the city that had previously been separated to be connected. In the 8448 project, there was this long servitude, electrical servitude, that ran right through the middle of it, and it gave an opportunity also to begin to start urban agriculture in that area. Now, I do want to say that my idea of high-density housing is not multi-story. It's 4-story housing, so that people on the top floor of it have got eye contact with people on the ground. And of course, in some carefully planned areas, it's going to be higher than that. However, I do think that our main effort in the CBD should be to counter the global trend of building a pile of vertical towers, projecting some corporations' dubious sense of self-importance to the world and leaving below hopelessly inadequate places for the citizens to occupy. Instead, we should be aiming to make or to restore a series of great urban rooms suitable for pedestrians. And we should take note of Jan Gel's findings recently that the more difficult you make it for people to go by car to the city centre, the more people you have in the city centre. And he's found that conclusively all over the world. To these public spaces, all new and adapted buildings or adapted buildings should be monitored to make a contribution. And I'm very pleased not to be at odds in any kind of a way with Cape Town's stated policy in this regard, but the things that you read in the newspaper often are in conflict with that. This drawing shows the Gugulethu project and the 8448 project linked together via a municipal site. And I think it gives some idea, if you have a bit of a look at it, at the kind of variety of urban space that would be made possible by this kind of method of planning. The major connections that are made through it, the variety of different kinds of urban space that you find in it, and also, in particular, the use of the municipal site, which in the current time is quite largely vacant, and could be put to much better use, and also to, again, link together areas of different kinds to evoke the kind of urban activity that we need to make the city really work. The Mthatha project, Spatial Development Framework project, of which this is a sketch, is a good one to end with. It was carried out by a consortium of 8 different consultants with assistance from others, and it was led by Barbara Southworth. And I think it could be argued that the city that we posited here spatially and as a process gives some idea of what a South African human-scale city could be like. I'll look at just 2 parts of it and hope to give some idea of the synergies it could evoke. Mthatha lies, as you can see, on this river that meanders along the northern side of it. It doesn't really relate to it at all, and the river is very polluted. The river is part of a much bigger system of tributaries that run in a series of valleys which define the topography of the city. We decided to preserve these for all time, resisting the idea of a major new national road bypass that was intended to come in one of the most important valleys. This framework gives the city a clear identity related to its particular topography of all this pieces of countryside really threading right through into it. It helps satisfy the need for subsistence, i.e. long-term survival, by preserving microecological systems, by making spaces for urban agriculture, and providing free control and filtering of stormwater. It's overlooked by bands of high density housing, giving protection while increasing density. It serves as a continuous space for formal and informal recreation and for cultural pursuits. It provides pedestrian and cycle routes through the entire city, giving great freedom of movement and linking with pedestrian bridges over the river, previously separated areas of Mthatha. The density increases that we proposed, which were this lining of the valleys, an increase in the density of the suburbs with various legislation and changes and rates, incentives, rather like Cape Town is going through now, encouraging living in the CBD. It all made it extremely easy to double the population of the city within its borders, even with these large swathes of land being free. Right, I must try and summarize this. I just remember when Peter Rich, a friend of mine, was giving the lecture in Bloemfontein, the Sophia Gray lecture, I said to him, now Peter, don't speak a minute longer than an hour. And here I am doing it myself. If we step back from these projects for a moment and consider all of them, we can think of them as little seedling trays being made ready for a big garden, the human-scale city of the good life. Like a garden, it will not be a something, a static product, but a place which grows, changes, and reseeds itself in all sorts of interesting ways. This will go some way towards averting the chaos and placelessness of the megacity by making the infrastructure or framework of main public spaces, which will give order and provide good living space onto which all the smaller additions of individual human beings can hang. I'm sure you'll agree from looking at all of this that what we need to prepare is not very complicated. There are no insurmountable technical difficulties in a 2 to 4 story pedestrian city, no new policies to devise. They're all built into national policy and spatial development frameworks all around the country. And parts of it are already happening, but in my ideas, not nearly quickly or comprehensively enough. Adam Habib, in that same Grahamstown talk, said that we're at one of those crucial moments of a reckoning, where if we take the wrong route or hesitate too long before deciding, we could plunge ourselves into a period of conflict that could bring us to our knees. And the right route, he implied, was collectively to declare war on the inequity in our society. If this is so, we people involved in some way or another with making the city have to do serious battle with its inequities, and we have to take it on as a military campaign, as in the struggle for freedom, with all the focus and organization, strategic thinking, flexibility, discipline, breaking of normal rules that implies. And the first thing that we must do is to stop a number of things. Stop extending the boundaries of the city, taking up valuable rural land or land in the city. Stop building new roads. Stop allowing easy vehicular access into the CBD. Stop building suburban institutions that favor the wealthy and reinforce the need for motor cars. Shopping malls connected only to roads, gated villages above a certain size, office parks and industrial parks far from residential areas, and so on. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think we should have a huge campaign of focused city building to be initiated. Much like when the ANC first came into power, they talked about kickstarting the economy with housing, something like that, something on a huge scale, which will, on the one hand, be the building of the infrastructure of public spaces that will thread through the whole city and give it identity and provide places where all the citizens can interact and so on. And secondly, building the houses. A combination of the public sector, the business community, the unions and representatives of civil society have got to build the first, and the people themselves have got to build the second, with financial assistance, expert advice and training. In one sense, the campaign is massive. It needs to encompass many different areas at the same time, and building such an infrastructure obviously is a massive project. In another sense, it's small, made up of a myriad of small projects, small enough for individuals to make a contribution. Of course, people will ask where the money is going to come from. We'll say the fiscus can't manage it. But the prospect is so positive, it's difficult to imagine a more synergic, widespread satisfaction of human needs as a project to embark on. It'll make jobs, augment skills, stimulate initiative and self-reliance, provide good shelter, evoke a sense of pride and ownership, and it'll make a difference to people's quality of life. It'll give a focus for collective endeavor that will greatly help bring the disparate members of our society together and address the dangerous inequities that threaten us. So instead of trying to emulate the consumerist cities of the world, this will show them what to do. Making a human-scale city can be a great opportunity, in my view, for lasting human development, and I don't think we can afford to miss it. Thank you.